Good morning and welcome everybody to the second session of our two-day conference. Thank you all for joining. Really looking forward to this session. My name's Pete Kent. I'm going to be moderating the session this morning. I'm Programme Director at Rower Children, and before we kick off, just a little housekeeping. All of your microphones and videos are disabled, so you won't be able to use those for the duration of the session. Please do use the chat box if you want to communicate with other participants, and the Q&A box for any questions that you want to put to the panel. Translation is available. All of the presentations are going to be in English. So if you'd like translations into Swahili, then there is a translation function which you'll see at the bottom of your toolbar. So yeah, that's the housekeeping. So I'll now sort of introduce the session. We're going to be looking at therapeutic models for family reunification, interventions that can improve family relationships and reduce violence within the home. The title of this conference is Breaking the Cycle of intergenerational violence, of embedded patterns of abuse that are passed on from generation to generation. And, you know, how do we do that? That's complex. And the aim of this conference is to share approaches that we believe have been able to do that, at least to some extent. And it's Rower Children's sort of hypothesis that mainstream programming in and of itself, if we want to reach the most marginalized, the most vulnerable populations that are left behind, our focus is supporting children on the streets, and these are very much one of those populations that are left behind by mainstream programming. And our hypothesis is if we want to support them, if we want to change their lives and break that cycle, then we have to find differentiated models of intervention. We have to find support them to actually turn their lives around. Mainstream programming will not do that. So this session is going to look at two models that have some evidence of doing just that, of improving family relationships, reducing violence within the home, and giving these children a chance of growing into adults that can break that cycle of intergenerational violence. So both models that can be applied in low-income countries, both models that can be applied by laypersons, by people that don't need a PhD in psychotherapy. And the presentations are going to come from, the first one is a presentation of Rower Children Africa's own work, our intensive family work approach, and that will be presented by Mary Gatama, who is Rower Children Africa's program manager based in Dar es Salaam. For those of you that registered some time ago, you may have noticed on Eventbrite the explanation around this session. We were hoping to have a presentation also from Sylvia Reyes from Huconi, Ecuador, but unfortunately she's not been able to attend. She's had to go to court. So Mary will cover some of the sort of theoretical backgrounds to the approach that Sylvia would have covered in her presentation. We're then going to have a presentation from Jane Thompson, who is Rower Children's Research and Impact Manager, and she'll be presenting some findings of an impact study that we've been trying to explore the extent to which the approach Mary is presenting can actually improve family relationships and reduce violence. We're hoping to be joined by Joyce Wamui, who is Senior Researcher at the National Institute for Medical Research in Tanzania, NIMRI. She's based in Mwanza, and she has been the lead researcher on the study that Jane will be presenting. She won't be presenting, but hopefully she'll join us for the Q&A session. We're going to have two Q&A sessions. one midway after the Roa children team have presented. And then we will be joined by Stephanie Skavensky. She is working with Johns Hopkins Bloomsbury School of Public Health, and she's going to be presenting the SETA approach, which is a systemic approach to reduce violence that can be applied with both individuals and also in families. And that's been developed by the Centre for Disease Control in collaboration with Johns Hopkins. Stephanie is actually based in the States, so her presentation is pre-recorded. Because of the time difference, she was worried about interruptions if she did it live, but she will be joining us for the Q&A. There'll be a second Q&A specifically around the SETA approach. So I'm really looking forward to this session, really interested to hear more about the approaches that are going to be presented, and hopefully some questions from the floor that we can put to the panel during the Q&A. So that's enough from me, and I'll hand over to Mary Gautama. Thank you.
Everyone, thanks for joining us, and I'm excited to share about our work at Railway Children in supporting children and families we work with. My screen is okay. Thank you. The view. Apologies, just the view here. So a bit of background about our work and our journey, how we've learned. Our journey, how we've come through. So we started implementation in 2010 in Mwanza, and with support from USAID Kizazi Kipya, we've been able to replicate this work in 6 cities in Tanzania. So one of the challenges we experienced at the beginning was we'll take children home and 50% will go back on the street. So it's literally we are recycling children. So we sought out to understand what was happening, because so we started a study in Kenya and Tanzania, which is called Struggling to Survive. And what we found out is extreme violence was one of the push factors for children that were living and working on the streets. So we sought out a solution. We came across an organization based in Mexico, CONI, and they were implementing this family therapeutic model. And so we went a journey of a lot of training, a lot of mentoring, and just to understand the issue. And the focus of this training was really understanding trauma and attachment theories, because I think when we understand the issue, then how we respond also, it informs how then we respond. So I would really encourage for people that want to explore working in this way with their children and families to really take their time to understand trauma and attachment theory, and because that's really the foundation of what we do. So there's a bit of statistics. As we can see, 60% of the children that in Tanzania have experienced violence, both boys and girls, and it's either by a relative or even by teachers. So violence is quite prominent, and it therefore dictates that whatever we do, we need to address the issue of violence when we're working with the children and families. So our family work is actually classified into two. We have the intensive family work and the non-intensive family work. And the focus of my presentation today is on the intensive family work. And one of the criteria for our intensive family work is children that have experienced extreme neglect, sexual abuse, extreme emotional and physical violence. And I don't know how many of you were in the safeguarding webinar. You did see that we do work with children that have experienced sexual abuse, and we work together with the police, and also we support the family through that process. So, and also it's important for the intensive family work that there's a caregiver that is willing to work with us, because it's, as the name states, it's quite intensive. We are talking about weekly visits, 1 hour every week. So there's a commitment also from the caregiver to be able to engage with us in this process. So we have a 2-year commitment with the families and children we work with to support through the, the process, and so that they can, they can parent better, the children can experience, happy childhood, I'll say. So the non-intensive family work, we do follow the same case management process. The only thing is that with the non-intensive family work, the main need is usually the physical needs. So it will be the poverty, the main issue will be the poverty, and those we can easily address, and they progress very fast through the process of our family reintegration work. So our theory of change for the work we do is the children and the families we work with are trapped in a cycle of violence, cycle of exclusion, and cycle of poverty. And so they're in the middle. So that means what we do is to help break this cycle so they can step out of these cycles. So as we know that children that experience violence, neuroscience says that they will also be perpetrators of violence themselves. So then it becomes a cycle of violence. And also poverty, the stress that it brings can also lead to violence. So, and again, with violence, then it comes to the impact of violence as we know it, is that it impacts how we feel about ourselves, how we behave. And that means how it looks like, it's that these children will be dropping from home, dropping from school. If it's a family, they'll have maybe issues with addictions, and they're excluded from the community. And once exclusion, then it means they will not be able to advance in terms of education, and then they're caught up in that cycle of poverty. So that means the work we do, or the work we need to do, is to break this cycle, to give these children and families to step out and be able to progress and experience what good relationships look like, and good lives. So what we want to achieve for the young people is that they are safe. They have a chance to process the negative experience they've had, especially the experience on the streets, the experience while at home, maybe the violence they faced, and to be ensured that once we reunify them in their homes with their caregivers, it's a safe place and they're protected. And also they have good attachment with their caregiver. As we know, we are all wired for attachment. For the caregivers, what we need to see is they have the parenting knowledge, they have the skills and the behavior, they have a support network within the communities, they have improved relationship with their children, and as a whole, as a family, increased strengths, and they have positive coping strategies and communication. So this is the structure of our family work, of our intensive family work. It's around visit once a week. We use strength-based approach. We facilitate positive attachment, supporting processing traumatic experiences, and positive communication and interaction. So this is the framework of family intensive work. As you can see, it starts with the individual, and it's really important to start with the individual, because if an individual feels cared for, and then they're able to transmit that to the other members of the family. And at the beginning of our work, the social workers have to do a lot of modeling. So they have to help the children feel, even the families and the caregiver, to feel how it feels to be cared for somebody to be thinking about you, for somebody to have you in mind. So it's really important that the individuals have the experience of how good relationships look like, and then they can replicate with the other members of the family. So with the relationship here, the caseworker is actually the one who is sort of driving things at this point. And then again, when the individual have had good enough experience of being cared for, then we are able to bring the children together. So at the start, maybe the children will be at the residential center. So the caseworker will be working with the child at the residential center, and also having sessions with the caregivers at home. And then it's sort of preparing them for them to be together. So in terms of the 3 stages, as you've seen the triangle, so the focus of the first stage is for the individual to feel empathy, to be shown how empathy looks like. Also, it's important for consistency. So if a caseworker says, I'll be there today at 2, they're there at 2, and to help them, the individual feel respected and given the attention and the acceptance that they need. And with the family at this stage, we are seeking to create positive interactions. More often than not, the family we work with, it's always negative interactions sometimes, and most of the time actually. And so the children, how they relate with their parents is out of fear, out of, they're always on the alert. And so our work involves around creating positive experiences, simple things as celebrating birthdays, celebrating good performance in school, and helping the families to really, have a smile, have laugh together. We play a lot of games, simple games, and that helps to have a positive interaction between the children and the parents. The second stage is the processing experience. And really here it's for them to make sense of what have happened to them, to get insight of what has happened to them and how it's affecting how they behave, how they're interacting with other people, and also to be able to talk about that, to share their pain, and somebody to be able to hold their pain and just to help them through that process. And this is where we also facilitate mediation between the child and the family, for the child to be able even to share how they feel, maybe how their experience on the street was, to be able to share with their parent. And it's this process, it's really important, and the role of the caseworker needs to be the one that makes sure that this is also a process that is, safety, there's safety around that. And the last stage is apply learning, whereby you start to see the family taking the lead, they're taking responsibility, they're interacting differently, the parents are able to show affection and meet the needs of their children. They're also able to set short-term and long-term goals. So how does it look like in application? So I thought I would share a case study. This is Brian. We contacted Brian in Mwanza. He was in 2017, he's 11 years old. And the reason for going to the street was physical and emotional abuse, particularly from the father. So, and also he witnessed his father emotionally and physically abusing his mother. And in some incidences, sexually, the father sexually abusing the mother in front of the children. So, he came to the streets, and he will also, as forms of punishment, his father would send him home, to bed without food. So when he came to the streets, he was scared. We rescued him. We took him to the residential center, and he really wanted to be reunified. But his only fear was that things will not have changed at home. So we had to start the work with the family. So for the relationship process, for Brian, this happened while at the center. For the family, it happened at home. So we played a lot of games. You can see our caseworker there playing with the children at home. And at the beginning, the father was not willing to engage with us. However, after 6 months into the process, because the children will be telling the father, what did the caseworker do today? We do a lot of drawing. So he'll come home and we'll see the drawings, and that made him curious. And also he started to see the change in the children, in the mother, and that made him curious. And after 6 months, he was able to join the process. So he engaged with us. And part of the processing experience was for Brian to be able to share with the father and the mother what he experienced while on the streets, and also how he had experienced the violence from his father. And the father was able to listen and to see how his behavior had impacted Brian and why Brian had dropped to the streets. And at the same time, also the mother we had individual sessions with the mother, and also for her to be able to share how he experienced the violence that he was receiving from the father. So this, and also the father also had a drinking problem. I think I forgot to mention that. So in terms of applying learning, Brian So at the end, Brian was able to go back to school. The mother was supported to start a business. The father has actually even extended the house. They have a 2-bedroom house. They had a 1-room house, which didn't have any privacy, and that was really disturbing, especially for Brian. That's one of the things that he had a challenge with. So I'm happy to say that Brian is at home. They're a happy family. The father is no longer experiencing any violence from the father, and the relationship between the father and the mother is quite good. So just a bit of outcomes from our work is this is statistics for 2018 to 2021. So our retention rate, out of the 1,765 children we've reunified, we've reintegrated, 80% are at home and in school. 76% of these families have reported an improved relationship, and 64% have improved in terms of income. So what have we learned? I mean, what are the, sorry, my slides, what are the challenges we've experienced in our work? It's the normalization of violence towards children. So there's a need to build awareness within the communities around violence and its impact on children development, and as well as on adults. Then also that families have multidimensional needs, and so there's need for clear coordination. And when you're working with a family, you need to really do the mapping of the other resources within that community, so that family, there's a sort of a safety net around this family. Another challenge is, and something that we've had feedback from the donors, is this work is costly. However, if we don't do anything and we don't break this cycle, it's actually much more expensive to the society. So what the lessons learned, that interventions for a child are sustainable when the context also changes. So if you just work with the child or the family in isolation, it's not sustainable. We need the support is needed for the parents as much as for the child if you're to change the life of that child. Also, they need to build awareness in communities and government in how they view street-connected children, to see them not as a problem, but as an issue. The understanding of the problem, then of the issue, then the response, it informs how we respond. Then we cannot ignore the emotional needs and the relational needs of families. This needs to be addressed alongside the physical and the practical needs. And also the need to invest in staff. So how the staff see the issue and how they respond needs to be informed by training and mentorship and coaching. So thank you very much. 15 minutes seems very little, but thank you very much, and looking forward to your questions.
Right, hello everybody, welcome. I'm going to talk to you about an evaluation that we conducted on some of the work that Mary's just been describing. So I'm going to talk for about 20 minutes, and then there'll be plenty of time for questions. So first of all, I'm going to talk about the aims of the study, what we were trying to do. I'm going to talk about the methods, who we recruited, and the tools that we used. I'll go through some of our results and some of our preliminary findings, reflect a bit on the process, and then say a bit about what we think we've learned and some implications for that going forward. So, there we go. So the aims, we particularly wanted to evaluate the impact of the sustained relational support. So in Mary's presentation, you'll have heard that, of course, there's a lot of practical things that we do in terms of food parcels, in terms of supporting families to be able to improve their income, in terms of getting children into education. But it was also a very key part of our hypothesis that it was actually that relational support, that it was the work on attachment and enabling families to process trauma that was really one of the things that made the difference and prevented children from returning to the streets and kept families together. So we defined sustained relational support, as you'll see it on the slide, as the regular visiting of children with that aim of promoting attachment and enabling families to process trauma and learn from things that they've been through. And originally, we had planned this as a randomized control trial because we were trying to isolate that relational element and look at if we did less of that and more of practical support, and a group where we did more relational support, whether we'd be able to determine a difference. Now, in practice, that wasn't workable, and we actually changed our method. So I'm happy to take questions about that at the end, but at the moment, I'm just going to talk about the method that we actually used. Okay, so first of all, obviously, we were recruiting families who met our criteria for intensive support, and they were asked to consent. And there was, if they declined to consent, there was no impact on the service they received. We chose 2 projects for the evaluation to take place. One was Kivuko and one was Chekesana, Tanzania. They were both located in Mwanza. And we took baseline measurements, not at the moment that the children were in contact with us, the moment the families entered the work. We did it after 3 to 4 visits. And one of the reasons that we did that is we needed to be sure that trust was established, because we wanted to be as sure as we could that we were getting the truth about the violence that was going on in the family. So we repeated that measurement after approximately 1 year. And in a few cases, we repeated it again after 2 years. We didn't combine the results from those 2 projects because the 2 projects worked differently. So Chekesana used centres more than Kivuko did. It was very much within their model to work with the child in the centre for quite a while before reintegration, whereas Kivuko tended to only use the centre if it was really, if there was a really urgent need for it. Okay, so I don't know if people in the audience are familiar with the International Child Abuse Screening Tool. It's a measure of abuse, and it's in subcategories of physical, emotional, sexual abuse and neglect. And it also checks out the extent to which children have sought help for the situation they're in. It's often used to measure prevalence. In fact, you've probably more likely come across it as a measure of prevalence. And when it's used like that, the questions are asked in terms of the past year and in terms of lifetime exposure to certain types of abuse. It can, however, be used in a before and after sense to try and look at levels of abuse before and after an intervention has taken place. And that's the way in which we were using it here. It's also the period of a year we felt was quite a long time for a child in particular to reflect on. And some work had been done by some academics on developing a version called ICAS trial that had been used in South Africa and had also been used in a shorter time frame. So it asked people about things that had happened in the past month. And we felt that was more manageable for the children and families that we were working with. We also used the conflict tactics scale to look at intimate partner violence. And we talked to a small sample of the caregivers about their experience of the service and the changes that they saw within their family. And then very recently, we looked at the children that had stayed in the study to see whether they were still at home or whether they were back on the streets or whether something else had happened to them. So those together were our measures of violence and abuse within the families. Okay, so I'm going to focus mainly on the ICAS today, and mainly on the version where the 10 to 14-year-olds were self-reporting instances of abuse. So the sorts of things, if you're not familiar with it, they're asked questions like, how often did you see adults shouting and hitting each other in the home? How often did your carer wish you were dead? How often did your carer hit you with a stick? Those sorts of things, and there are subcategories. And these are our results from the subcategories. So what we did is we looked at how many times children had said this happened at interview 1, and how many times they said this had happened in the last month at interview 2. And as you'll see across the whole range, there were very clear reductions in the abuse that was reported at interview 2 compared with the abuse that was reported at interview 1. So for example, witnessing abuse between adults was down by 72%, emotional abuse by 79%, neglect by 81%, and physical abuse by 92%. And overall, there was an 83% in reduction between incidents that were reported at interview 1 and incidents that were reported at interview 2. So the way that sexual abuse was measured was a bit different. So children weren't asked about how many times something had happened. They were simply asked if it had happened at all. And in the first interview, so the table doesn't split this by individual. The table just shows you how many young people answered yes in that, to that question. But 8 young people reported at least one type of abuse at interview 1. And by interview 2, that had reduced to 1 young person. Now, the children at Kivuku do work with more males than females. And of the children that had before and after interviews in the study, 13 were male and 2 were female. But in this instance, the young person who was still reporting incidents at interview 2 was male. So those are the results of the child interviews for Kivuku. And these are the results for Chekasana. The gender split with Chekasana was more even. So we had 7 males and 8 females who were answering. Again, the reductions across all categories, witnessing abuse 30%, emotional abuse 37%, neglect 54%, and physical abuse, again, by far the highest reduction was seen in physical abuse at 75%. So slightly different numbers, but overall a similar pattern to what we saw in Kivuku. And the sexual abuse, and it was a more complex picture in Chekasana about the sexual abuse, and one that I think is one of those areas that we'll be going back to and trying to have a look at what might have been going on here. So 8 young people reported abuse at interview 1, and 4 of those, there were no further incidents. But interestingly, 3 young people who hadn't reported any incidents at first did so by interview 2. And also, if you look at the table, you'll see the numbers of, very severe, very serious incidents there, rape and attempted rape. They're actually much higher than it was in Kivuku. So I think when we look at what do we want to think about next and what do we want to explore, certainly this area of sexual abuse is something we want to look at. Okay. So as I said, last month we went back to the 30 children who had stayed in the study, 15 in Kivuku and 15 in Chakasana, and we looked at what was going on for them at the moment. So in Kivuku, 14 were still at home in the original home, and one had been relocated to a different family member. So he was still in a family home, but not the original one. In Chakasana, there'd been some difficulties with reintegration with some of those young people, and they'd been brought back to the centre for some further work. So 3 young people were still in the centre. 1 young person was going between home and the centre, and the others had stayed reintegrated at home. But none of the children in the study had returned to the streets. Now, obviously, one of the issues that we had was we couldn't really isolate the relational aspect of the work from the other support that was provided. So what was useful to us was to hear from some of the parents what they thought about the changes in their family and what had helped. And I think these 2 quotes are interesting because it does show that relational aspect was having an influence on their thinking. So, for example, the first person here is saying that the first caregiver is saying that she thought the way to manage children was to be very strict and was to beat them. And now she realizes that there are different ways, and she's seen a difference in their behavior in terms of going to the streets. And in the second quote, I think this is very much part of the philosophy of the model that we're using, is about being alongside people and being there for them, particularly when things are difficult. And this caregiver has said particularly about the worker being there for them and not giving up on them, even when the behaviours that they were being faced with were quite difficult. So that's useful feedback for us. And then in terms of some of our preliminary findings, well, both projects clearly showed positive results. We weren't able to isolate the relational aspect of the work, but it was clear that before and after that intervention, given that we cannot control all variables as well, but before and after that intervention, levels of physical, emotional, and sexual abuse and neglect had all reduced. A very, very marked reduction in physical violence across both projects. And none of the children who stayed in that study were back on the streets sometime later. So right up to last month, those children weren't back on the streets. And our reflections on some of the challenges. There were quite a lot of challenges with working with such a marginalised and complex group. Obviously, doing a before and after study, we could only use children who were being returned to the same caregiver, and because sometimes that might be felt that's not the best thing for the child, that limited the number of participants we had. Even after the families were recruited, there could be changes in circumstances like relocation, and that meant again we would lose some families from the study. As I said, we couldn't isolate that relational aspect perfectly. We can say that it's in there, but we can't say that categorically it is that that's made the difference. And also because of literacy, we couldn't just administer these as paper questionnaires or, for example, questionnaires on tablets that people can just do privately and nobody really knows what you said and it's very anonymous. So these interviews had to be administered, and that's difficult. It's difficult to ask families to share such very personal details about their lives. And also in terms of when you're asking about you going in the second time and asking again, then there is a risk of some social desirability bias, because obviously you're providing the service, and the families may want to say that things have changed. So it's something we need to be mindful of. Okay, so some of our sort of early conclusions and thoughts. So there was a significant reduction in levels of abuse within this sample, and we must acknowledge that this is a small sample that we were able to retain for some of the issues that I've mentioned. But there was a significant reduction in levels of abuse within this sample after they'd received the support that included relational support. Physical violence reduced the most, and it was abuse between adults in the home, seeing abuse between adults in the home, that seemed to be the most resistant to change. Sexual abuse reduced overall, but there was a more complex picture in Czechoslovakia, and it would be interesting to really to look at that in a bit more detail. And I mentioned that ICAST also measures help seeking, and I think what's interesting in terms of planning services is that even when levels of abuse were quite high, help seeking among children was quite low. So for me, that speaks to the need for those proactive outreach activities that reach children where they are, rather than expecting that children and families in need will come to you and seek you out as a professional. So that's my presentation for now, and we're happy to take questions on anything that's been presented.
Great, thank you so much. And I think your final sentence there, Jane, really does speak to the point of this conference, is in that, you know, we need to develop specialist services for hardest to reach populations. And, you know, you've presented some evidence there around the fact that these children that we are trying to reach, they won't come to us, and they're not engaged in school. They're often out of families, so they will not be supported from mainstream interventions. We have to design specific interventions. We want to ensure we don't leave the most marginalised behind. So we've had quite a lot of interest in the chat box. There's quite a lot of questions come forward, and we've got a good 15 minutes. So hopefully we might cover a good number of them. So the first, I'm going to put to Mary two questions. I'll read them both because they're both related to the case study, and I think in responding to them, you may actually cover some of the other questions that have come to you as well. So the first one is, did you support Brian's family financially in building the house? And then how did you do that? And if not, how did they do that? And the second one is, I'm happy with Brian's story, but how did services extend to Brian's father, as it seems he had individual issues that had to be addressed? So for the 6 months in the process, how did the case manager work with Brian's father in reference with the model? So just to summarise, two questions, Mary. One is, did we provide financial support to assist in building the house? If so, how? If not, how did they do it? And secondly, how did we engage Brian's father in the process?
Okay, thank you, Pete. So we didn't support Brian's family to build the house, to extend the house. It was actually them that they did it. We supported the mom in to start a business. Initially, the father did not want his wife. It was mainly him, and he changed that, and he allowed us to work with the mother to support the mother in business, and together it improved their family income, and they were able to build this extra room. Or especially that I hope I mentioned that they have 8 kids. For the second question, how do we support the father in the first 6 months? So we did continue and informing him that we are visiting the family every week. So even though he didn't really engage in the first 6 months, but when he finally engaged, we had to start, we did individual work, and him understanding how his behavior was impacting his family. And there was a lot of, he didn't feel respected as a man, and even within the community, because he was struggling with alcohol, and just him and gaining insight about his behavior and that shift, and how even the family now interacted with him. I think that led to his behavior change, but also how we interacted with him. I think in the community, he was seen as, that he was really excluded, but our interaction was different. So he experienced our interaction quite differently, and that really helped him to start engaging with us and seeing us as using a different approach from how he has experienced other people that have tried to work with his family before. I hope I've answered.
Great, yeah, thank you, Mary. Yeah, and interesting, you talked about there being 8 children in the home, and the fact that they were able to add on an extension to their home themselves. And I think that speaks to some of the sustainability of the approach, in that they were able to improve their financial situation because we were able to support them relationally. They were able to sustain that. Okay, I'm going to ask one more question, pass on one more question to you, Mary, there's also 1 or 2 for you, Jane and Joyce, who I believe is now with us. So you mentioned 80% success rate in terms of children still at home and thriving, that we reintegrated over the 3 years. So what is the learning from the 20% that have presumably returned back to the streets after reunification?
Yeah, I think the learning is that I think one of the challenges I mentioned is that the families we work with have really, really multi-dimensional needs. And I can maybe draw from one of the families we've tried to work with, where the mother had really serious mental issues in terms of her ability to be able to even start engaging with us. So, and I must say, those are the most difficult families, because if we are talking about serious mental issues, and this particular family, the mother, the children, they were living on the streets, and it needs, for us to, some of the families, they really need many, many years of intervention. An extended period of intervention. I think the learning is that there are some families that need a longer term commitment for us to achieve that change. And that's why this approach can be seen to be expensive, because if you're talking about people with serious mental issues, then the commitment, and even to be able to link them with the mental health support that's also another, in terms of accessibility of mental health in Tanzania, it's also another issue there. So I'd say that it's to recognize that families have really, really multidimensional needs, and there are some families that really need a longer term commitment. So it doesn't mean that we have given up on the 20%. We are still working with them. They're still in the program. But it seems before we see change, we need to put in more.
Okay, all right, thank you. And interestingly, from the sample that was used in the study, Jane, all 30 of those children were still at home at the end of that process. So it'd be interesting to understand more around that, actually, and what the differences might have been with that cohort and the 1,000 or more that have been reintegrated over the last 3 years. Okay, so there is a question related to the research. So that Jane or Joyce could take this. You'd mentioned at the start that originally the study was designed as a randomized controlled trial, but then then a different method was chosen partway through. What can you tell us a bit more about that? Why was that?
Yeah, certainly. I mean, I'll start, and then if Joyce wants to jump in, feel free, Joyce. I think one of the issues was that we realised that we weren't going to be able to get sufficient numbers to make this statistically significant, which is important in terms of randomised controlled trials. We also realised that we actually weren't able to control the other variables well enough. So if you were doing an RCT in a lab, obviously one of the really important things is that you control everything else while you do this thing, so that you can say and know that it is that thing that has made the difference. In practice, there were a lot of changes going on, and as I've described, we could recruit someone to the study, and then the best thing for that child could be then to be moved to a different caregiver, to a member of the extended family. And so, of course, that doesn't work in terms of the study. And another issue was that it was actually very difficult for staff to come to terms with the fact that we would be looking at giving different levels of service, albeit still, you know, a service and a safeguarding service, but that we would be looking at giving different levels of service based on a random allocation rather than a detailed assessment of need. And I think obviously safeguarding is paramount. And in a few cases, there was some kind of safeguarding incident, and staff felt that it wasn't safe for that child to remain with the slightly lower level of relational support, that family really needed the highest level of relational support that we could provide. And that was what was going to keep that child safe. And for that reason, they were taken from the control group. But you can see that if you've got small numbers to start with, and then you get some taken from the control group, you start to realise that actually this model isn't going to work. We have to do this in a different way. I don't know if you want to add anything to that explanation, Joyce?
Yeah, I think that's really excellent, Jen. As we all know, actually, street children or street connected children are actually a really delicate and fluid population. So in terms of even randomization itself, you don't have a steady population that you're starting off with. And that made actually the design quite challenging because you're recruiting as you go. And when you get a child in problem, like was the case for this study, you immediately enroll them in services. So you don't put them, you don't think about randomizing. The priority for every children here was actually to help. So it just made the design quite unuseful to really continue doing the same way. And clearly I would say, or rather recommend that randomized controlled trial, as much as it's the gold standard, it might not be actually the right design for a population like this that is very fluid, but also requiring urgent attention to the extent that you don't have the luxury. First of all, you don't have the population ready to randomize. And then as you're randomizing, initially, the thinking was actually relatively good because it was the children who had been randomized into the control. In case they experienced any major issues, they would immediately be shifted into the intervention arm. So clearly then that wasn't going to work as a randomized control trial. So the method that was adopted, which was before and after, in as much as it might not be as robust, it was practical for this population. So we think we always have to think carefully in terms of design when we are talking about a population that is fluid and also quite delicate like these children.
Great, thank you. Okay, so there's ethical reasons really, and that too many children that went into the control group actually required a more intensive service than they would have received in the control group. Therefore, the sample size wasn't big enough. Is that more or less in short? Okay, all right, great. That's a really interesting question. I think there's a lot of questions coming through, a lot of comments in the chat box. We've got time for certainly one, possibly two more questions before we move to listening to Stephanie's recording. So again, for Mary, so therapeutic interventions take time and require a lot of resources. So how do you balance the demand of donors for high numbers with this approach?
Yeah, that's an interesting question. I think maybe one of the I mean, how we balance. First of all, I think we've tried to educate our donors, and maybe us sharing our work and this approach. It's also one way of ensuring that there's also an understanding that there's a population that needs a different kind of intervention, and it involves resources, but also trying to capitalize on the already existing resources within the communities also helps to bring the cost down. So we don't work in isolations. We are working with the existing resources within the communities and ensure that these families are linked to the resources within their communities. For example, I said we implement with support from Kizazi Kipya. We did connect with other services that were being provided in the greater project. So in a way, it helps to balance. As well as being able to do a lot of prevention work in the community. So you can demonstrate that while you're doing this intensive work, you're also doing a greater intervention in terms of prevention. And so I think, yeah, it's a way of balancing if you're doing prevention as well as responsive.
Okay, all right, great. Yeah, and I think to add to that, I don't think Railway Children, I don't think, Mary, you're advocating that this level of intensive support is required for every child.
No.
This is part of a broader programme where there is support for a greater number of children with a range of needs, where we can help turn their lives around with much lighter touch interventions. But for those children with the most complex needs that come from the most damaging backgrounds, this is a model of intervention that can help rebuild those family connections and make it safe for reintegration to be possible, or perhaps not in some cases, but at least for those relationships to be rebuilt to an extent. Okay, and that links, actually, there is another question also around costs and around social return on investment. Railway Children did do a study some years back now around this intervention in Kenya, a social return on investment study, and that found it was five in UK sterling terms, £5.17 for every pound invested in terms of social return. So I've answered another one of those questions there as well. I think we do have a bit more time, but I think we're going to move to the next stage of the session. So we're going to listen to Stephanie's recording, and then there will be another 15 minutes at the end for more Q&A. So there's quite a few questions that haven't been answered yet for the existing panelists. We'll see what questions come in for Stephanie, and if there's space to revisit some of these outstanding questions, then we'll do that. But for now, thank you all for your presentations, and we will pass over to Stephanie.
Hello, everyone. Thank you so much for joining today, and a big thank you to Railway Children and USAID for hosting this event. My name is Stephanie, and I'm part of the Applied Mental Health Research Group at Johns Hopkins University. And I'm going to be talking today about the global mental health and psychosocial response to violence. Just a little bit of background to begin with. We know that globally up to 1 billion children experience violence directly every single year, and tens of millions more are exposed and affected by violence, making this a very large and very real problem. We also know that experiencing and witnessing violence can lead to severe lifelong consequences for children and youth. This includes an increased risk of injury, disease, risky sexual behaviors, and mental health problems, as well as others. There are risk factors as well within a family that can lead to more exposure or experience of violence. Each of these risk factors can cause violence. And in particular, I want to highlight that heavy alcohol use is actually one of the most consistent and strongest risk factors to IPV perpetration. And one reason for really understanding these risk factors is that we really need to consider them when we think about prevention and interventions that we want to put in place for families, because these interventions really need to be focused on targeting these risk factors. And that often involves a multi-pronged approach. Just a little bit of my history and work in the field. So I have been lucky enough to work with children and families in over 17 countries, and started my career the first 10 years living in Zambia, with smaller stints living in Cambodia as well as DRC. And as part of my role, I got to be a part of several of our trials in the beginning. And those trials were initially on TFCBT, or trauma-focused cognitive behavioral therapy, where we run trials in Zambia and Cambodia, as well as trials on cognitive processing therapy in DRC. And within these studies, I really had the lucky role of being able to work directly with providers. So I would be on calls for supervision with our providers and supervisors on a weekly basis, and we would talk about the cases that they would see. These are clients with, faced with illness, grief, loss, depending on the context, violence. And one message that often and continually came up on our calls is that the providers only had one skill. In most of these cases, it was how to treat trauma. And yet the reality on the ground was the families they were faced with all sorts of different problems. They were suffering from problems like substance use, depression, active violence, suicide. And at the end of the day, the providers and myself were feeling pretty helpless when there's nowhere else to refer to in the community. It's a really helpless feeling, not knowing how to help someone that's suffering in front of you. And let's face it, for mental, emotional, and behavioral health impact, comorbidity is the norm. As a clinician myself, I've rarely seen an individual present with just one problem. What we see is individuals and populations who have worries, fears, anxieties, trauma responses, relationship problems, grief and sadness, substance use. And yet, despite this comorbidity, the current approach to providing services for mental, emotional, and behavioral health issues is a siloed approach. In fact, even within a silo, we see further separation. For example, in violence, we see community interventions, economic interventions, and MHPSS interventions. And each one of these interventions alone may have some impact on one or two outcomes, but none have shown to significantly and sustainably reduce the frequency and severity of violence, as well as help with other coexisting problems. I think as a team, we started really say to ourselves, is this the best we can do? And honestly, what happens with the siloed approach is that to help a family heal, you would have to train, roll out, and implement a large number of programs and treatments to address all of the needs. This is challenging at best, often impossible, and definitely costly and unsustainable. So one solution for silo busting within our field of behavioral, emotional, and mental health is CETA, or the Common Elements Treatment Approach. It's built as a modular and flexible program and has the ability to treat not just one or two problems, but a wide range, including depression, violence, trauma, aggression, substance use, safety, externalizing problems in youth, parenting, relationship problems, and hopefully soon CBT for psychosis. Research has also shown now with multiple randomized control trials that lay providers can deliver this effectively and learn to work with the flexibility across comorbidities. So let's take a closer look at SIDA. SIDA is not a new treatment. What you'll see here, probably some familiar names. It's really made up of CBT elements that are pre-existing and have a wealth of data behind them. What is different with SIDA is that we train providers and counselors how to put these elements together in different ways to address different problems and needs of an individual or a family. So some individuals might receive 5 sessions, some 7, and given its design, it has the flexibility to also be taken apart into just 1 or 2 elements, depending again on the need of the populations you're working with. As a team, we also believe that everyone deserves not just quality care, but effective treatments. So we're really keen to study the common elements treatment approach to make sure this new direction worked well. And what you'll see here on this slide, there's a lot of information on it, but I just wanted to highlight a couple of studies, a couple of our trials. And I think the big take home from this is across different contexts, from Thailand to Ethiopia to Iraq to Zambia and Ukraine, that we were working with a range of different ages, different populations, different comorbidities and problems. And lay providers were the ones providing SIDA across all of these trials. And what we found were pretty significant results across different outcomes, from depression to functioning to PTSD, internalizing and externalizing problems. And I also wanted to highlight in particular our trial in Zambia, where we were working with a family, women who were experiencing active violence in the home, where their male partner was using substances and there were children in the home. So we were working with families where there was active, severe, and frequent violence, as well as substance use. And in this trial, results showed clinically and statistically significant greater reductions in IPV in women who received SIDA compared to those that received a treatment as usual plus safety. There were also significantly greater reductions in the audit score, which is a measure of alcohol use and substance use. And that was from baseline to 12 months, as well as at 24 months, we did see a continued decrease in those, a sustained decrease in those outcomes. So in our trials, we also always use mixed methods. I think understanding a little bit more behind what families find most effective out of the intervention, also to see whether or not they found it feasible and acceptable. And so we always use a qualitative study as well to dig a little bit deeper into the active ingredients. And in the trial, participants found that they experienced as interrelated changes in response to SIDA that ultimately led to and included reductions in violence. So many participants described reductions in alcohol or even stopping drinking alcohol, and this was directly linked to reductions in arguments and ultimately violence. Participants also reported that reductions in alcohol use and violence led to them being able to earn more money, perform their household duties, support their family, and help with controlling anger. Importantly, women also described the use of safety strategies that help to reduce arguments. So now that we know kind of a little bit about what is SIDA, what's involved, and the evidence, I did want to spend a few minutes just talking a little bit more about how it's implemented. You know, as a program, if you were interested in doing this with families, what does this look like in a practical way? I want to start first by just showing you this. This is the MHPSS, kind of common MHPSS triangle. And really, when we think about SIDA, we think about it, really fitting across all of the different levels of care. So on the bottom in blue, you have your kind of primary prevention, as well as basic services, security, and kind of tier 1 level interventions. And, working your way up all the way to yellow, which is more specialized mental health care. And we really wanted to make sure that CETA was modular so that you could really pull out pieces in order to fill those lower levels of the triangle, as well as put pieces together to create a more comprehensive care for somebody with more moderate to severe problems. So let's take a closer look at the options. When we think about families in particular, I wanted to highlight that we can really start with prevention, as well as kind of offering some services and interventions that really look at, building coping skills for people with mild symptoms or for prevention, and really providing education. And then these first kind of CETA CSS sessions that can be done in group or individual also act as a way to identify and refer clients who might have more moderate to severe symptoms. So for example, in Ukraine, where we work with veterans, we run veterans groups where we just do a one-off CSS session where clients are offered cognitive coping as a skill building, as well as assessment and psychoeducation. And in those sessions, we're able to identify people who might have suicide risk or who might have post-traumatic stress disorder, and then really refer them up to providers who are trained in full CETA. So the next level is really having providers who are trained in full CETA, and these providers can offer up to 5 to 12 sessions, depending on what a client needs. In Zambia, for example, a provider, each member in the family would meet individually with a provider who is trained in CETA. And each individual within the family might have different needs. So the child might have been exposed to trauma, have some experience of trauma symptoms, as well as externalizing behaviors. And so their intervention will be really targeted to that. The male in the home, we know for that particular trial, all of the men were using alcohol. And so they all received substance use treatment, as well as other treatment for coexisting problems, and the women treatment for their trauma, having experienced violence, as well as safety. And then based on the individual woman, she might have some depression, so we would add that in, problem solving to find a job. There were all sorts of different variations within families, but the CETA providers are trained to pick and choose what they use based on the client in front of them. So you could have one provider that does all of this, or you could have providers that offer, that tier 1 level intervention in group or kind of one-off sessions individually, and then refer to providers who are trained in full CETA. So who can provide CETA? We really want, in all of our studies, we know that there are not a lot of professionals in mental and behavioral health. And so we really wanted an intervention that we could use, that we could train lay providers. And so most of our providers have a grade 4 education or above, no professional training in mental or behavioral health. I think the biggest things that we see that are most important in selecting providers are really finding providers who have a passion, who want to help their communities in this way, as well as those that have time. So we really want to select providers in the community who will sustain this, and having time to do these activities is really important. So when we think about training lay providers, I think the process of training is critical. We know from the literature that one-off trainings alone are just not effective, right? So our model of training really is an apprenticeship model where we train to competency. So if you think about that, it makes sense, right? If you think about learning any new skill, the more time you spend on it, the faster you'll be competent in it. And so time to competency and training to competency doesn't always take a lot of time. It just depends on providers' availability and how much they can do this within their current scope of work. And so part of the apprenticeship model really is that ongoing supervision and support as providers do this for the first time, as they're seeing these different cases and clients in the field, so that we can actively teach and coach as they're treating different families and different needs. and with the ultimate goal of having supervisors locally who continue to provide support and supervision for the groups, and then eventually train trainers locally. So with that, I'm going to end. It was a lot of information, but I'm out of time. If you want more information, definitely visit our website at cetaglobal.org. And I know that we're also going to be having a question and answer now. So I look forward to you responding to some of your questions. Thanks so much. Hello, everyone.
Well, thank you, Stephanie. You're now with us, which is fantastic. I know it's very early over there in the States, so thank you for setting your alarm. And thank you for pre-recording that. I assume nobody even knew, actually. I didn't need to tell them it was pre-recorded. But no, it's a really interesting presentation. I think it's quite incredible, actually, the impact that you're able to have in those quite short, limited number of sessions. So certainly as Roe Children, we're very interested in the approach and how that might be able to help us in our work. So we've had some questions, quite a number of questions. There's a couple that I think I'll put to you, Stephanie, and there's a couple then from previously that may go to Mary or Jane or Joyce. So the first one, so we know that trauma, depression levels can be different between one person to another. So how is it possible for CETA approach to work in the groups that you seem to apply it in?
Sure, I'm happy to respond to that. Thanks so much, Pete. So I think the biggest thing with CETA is the flexibility. And when we look at groups, we really try to assign children to a group that have similar symptoms and problems. We can also do pull-out sessions. So sometimes when we do trauma work in a group, they may not actually do the gradual exposure, which we know is the most effective element that's required, the most active ingredient to reduce traumatic stress symptoms in a child or a woman or a man. So when we work in groups, there are certain sessions that we would do together, and then we might have pull-out sessions with individual children. And some of those sessions might be 1 or 2 or 3 sessions long, where we have those separate sessions to do that work. But generally what we find is that for most of the introductory sessions, psychoeducation, cognitive coping, it requires the same amount of time. We also do pull-out sessions when there's safety involved. So if we need to do individual safety planning based on a child or family situation, the counselor or counselors would meet separately with the client and work through those safety planning. So really depending on the symptom levels, we try to pair children together who are on the same trajectory for treatment. And then if they need pull-out sessions individually, we're able to do that.
Okay, great, thank you. And then a related, well, another question around CETA, not specifically related actually to that one, but how do you keep providers motivated to continue to provide support if there is minimal funding for them?
I think this goes back to the question of who we're selecting for providers. And oftentimes what we find, like I said, is providers that end up sustaining this are ones that first have a real passion and interest for working with their community and working within their current job structure. So we work with a lot of community health workers and volunteers and try to work with them to shift some tasks that they had off their plate. So what could other people be doing that they were previously doing so that they can make the time to do this work instead? And I do think that supervision is key, right? So having that support and supervision, having a team and a group that, you know, continues to motivate you on the job is really helpful. Obviously, if possible, we always encourage organizations to provide additional support. So if there is slightly more funding, if there is a way to motivate people in other ways, that is great. But we do find that actually if people have the time and have the interest, that this can be done without that extra financial motivation.
Okay, great. That's really interesting and helpful. Thank you, Stephanie. And I think may actually loop back to some of the other questions that are being asked. So there's a direct question here which actually I think is relevant for both approaches. I'll ask you this, Mary, but feel free to chip in, Stephanie and others. Therapeutic models are powerful, but families struggle economically and have nothing to eat. How do you balance these?
Yeah, so when we're working with a family in a therapeutic way, we are addressing all, we're also looking at as you saw at our theory of change, we're also addressing poverty. So and also for a family to make the time to engage with you, if they're hungry, then they will not be able to engage. So we do provide physical needs, but that's not the main intervention, but we do provide physical needs. So we do provide food support when needed, and also economic empowerment where needed, but not all the families we are working with intensively that end up needing that.
Great, thank you, Mary. And I can see Joyce is wanting to come in and respond to that. Please, Joyce, karibu.
And yeah, maybe just to add on what Mary has said, actually these interventions should never or shouldn't be, or rather be encouraged that they're delivered as part of a package or as, addressing multiple sectors within settings, and not just as focused individual interventions that target these children, because these children are part of settings, they're part of these communities that are struggling. Some might struggle economically as someone brings it up. I've been working on parenting programs and how to really enable parents to really support their children to reduce child maltreatment in the general population. And you realize it's quite a huge struggle. Parents don't have authorities, families are struggling if they cannot feed their own children. And usually when funding comes, it's focused on a particular activity. It's rare to get a huge grant that is addressing multiple structural factors that tend to impact families, that tend to lead children to going to streets. Yeah, so really if you work within sectors that are linked within governments, working with social welfare, trying to see how different ministries, how different donors could work together, then it could address some of the economic issues, while actually those who have expertise in trying to support children directly on the streets would do that bit. But they somehow have to be linked if they have to be sustainable, actually long term. Because after a short while, then families remain families and programs face off. So the most really way that you can make this sustainable is working through existing government systems, supporting them, using even the economic interventions that are ongoing. For example, in Tanzania, we have one that has been on for a long time to really support very vulnerable families with a little funding just to help them support their children. So really linking this work with those existing systems would really address some of the angles that are not very specific to experts who work with children on the street.
Great, thank you, Joyce. That's really, really helpful. A bit of specific context there around some of the other packages of support that are available in Tanzania. I don't know, Stephanie, do you want to respond to that at all around how the SETA approach can sort of interface with the need to meet basic needs in some of these families?
Sure, happy to. Thanks, Kate. I think, this goes back to, I think, a point that I made in my presentation, that when we face these problems, it really does have to be a multidisciplinary approach, and that children and families face a number of different problems and stressors. And so we can't just use one approach to tackle them all. And one of those issues being poverty, being health needs, economic needs of the family. And so again, we work with organizations and we implement within an organization who has either referrals or resources to provide some of the other needs that SETA may not directly intervene on. But the hope of SETA is that you're building skills to help reduce violence and to help reduce stress so that children and families are more able then to look for work to problem solve around the issues that the families face with and access resources maybe that they weren't previously accessing.
Great. Thank you, Stephanie. And I think that very much chimes with the approach that Mary's been addressing, in that, you know, we understand that actually we need to address some of these emotional, relational, embedded trauma response issues that people have in order for them to be able to even engage with and be aware of and understand what support services are available to them. So yeah, I think that certainly resonates. There's a lot of synergy there. I think there's one question that's come up a couple of times, and we may have time for more than one more question. And this is, I think it's quite specific to the reintegration work that Railway Children is doing. And it's a question around the therapeutic intensive response is possible for children that are close to the project service, to the staff, but the nature of children on the streets is they're often, while you may contact them in one city, their family home may be several hundreds of kilometres away. So what's the solution for family support services that are a long distance away? I'll take that first, I think, to Mary.
What we try to do with the long distance families is we try to build a safety net around the family. So making sure that they are connected to the resources that within their locality. So this could be schools, the local leaders, if there are organizations that are working in that area. In Tanzania, we have, for example, TASAF, a government system that supports families that are struggling economically. So we try to build sort of a safety net around that family. What we don't make a commitment that we're going to be able to, for example, provide the intensive support visits just because of the distance. It's not realistic. However, we do identify other service providers within the locality of this family, and that's how then we do make a follow-up through those organizations. So our referrals, always we ensure that there's a follow-up if we've made any referrals to ensure that the families and the children are receiving the support services. So we do make follow-ups through the service providers that we have linked these families to.
Great. Yeah, thank you, Mary. And I think I'd like to add to that, you know, one of the reasons we organisationally are interested in approaches like SETA is I think that has the capacity perhaps to train up cohorts of laypersons, we don't need to have project staff in every location to be able to apply an approach like SETA. And that's you know, one of the reasons we're so interested in that, and invited Stephanie to come and present alongside what we're doing. So I don't know, Stephanie, if you want to add anything on. We haven't got any more time for any questions, so if you'd like to add anything there, Stephanie, then I think we'll wrap up.
No, I think that it's, you know, I think that the work that Railway Children doing with reunification is wonderful work. I think one of the things that we are doing in CETA to help support people from long distance, and obviously with a pandemic, is to train providers also in TCETA. So we have a manual that we've developed for distance use, and are currently working on training possibilities as well to do distant trainings, and have developed an application that people can use when we can't come and train anymore and when travel is less possible. And so I think that, again, thinking about systems of care and how you can use your current personnel to build up and provide quality care to children and families is really important. So I do think that, you know, thinking about how to build on the work that you're currently doing and to add on any way we can these interventions is fantastic. But thank you so much for having us.
You're very welcome, and thank you to all of the presenters. Thank you to everybody that's attended. I hope you found it interesting. I'm sorry that we haven't got to all of the questions that you've posed, but please do contact us over the email, and we'd be more than happy to pick up any of these conversations. And I hope you enjoy the rest of the conference. Thank you all. Asanteni.